It all started with a sandwich, a simple homemade sandwich offered by a little girl to a homeless man sitting alone in a park. But that one small act of kindness set off a chain of events that no one, not even her father, could have predicted. The next day, the police came knocking on their door, and what they revealed left Layla and her father, Marcus, stunned. What did Layla uncover about the man she helped, and how did her kind gesture lead to a moment that would change their lives forever? Stay tuned to find out. Before we dive into the story, if you enjoy tales of kindness, mystery, and life lessons, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 9-year-old Layla was the kind of child whose heart always seemed too big for her little frame. She lived with her father, Marcus, in a small 2-bedroom apartment nestled within a bustling but somewhat nosy neighborhood. The apartment wasn't much, it had creaky floors and thin walls, but it was home. Marcus, a hardworking single father, made sure their modest space was filled with warmth, love, and laughter. Layla was the kind of girl who noticed everything. She had a habit of pointing out things others overlooked. A lonely cat on the sidewalk, an elderly neighbor struggling with groceries, or a classmate sitting alone at lunch. "You have a radar for people who need help," Marcus would often say, half amused and half in awe of his daughter's compassion. It was a sunny afternoon when the story began. Layla had just finished school, her bright pink backpack bouncing on her shoulders as she skipped along the sidewalk. She always loved taking the long way home through the park. It was her little escape, a patch of green in their otherwise concrete-filled neighborhood. But as she rounded a corner toward her favorite spot by the swings, she noticed someone she hadn't seen before. Sitting on a weathered bench near the playground was a man who looked out of place. His clothes were worn, his beard scruffy, and his shoulders slumped as if he carried the weight of the world. He stared down at the ground, lost in thought. Layla slowed her pace, her natural curiosity kicking in. She noticed how his hands fidgeted nervously, and her sharp ears picked up the faint growling of his stomach. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning him carefully. She didn't see danger, just sadness. Reaching into her backpack, Layla pulled out the sandwich her dad had made for her as an after-school snack. It was peanut butter and jelly, her favorite. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. The man looked up, startled by the sound of her voice. His blue eyes, though tired and weathered, softened as they met hers. "Yes?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in a while. Layla held out the sandwich, her small hands trembling just a bit. "I thought you might be hungry. Would you like this?" For a moment, the man just stared at her, clearly taken aback. He glanced at the sandwich, then back at Layla. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't you need it?" Layla shook her head. "I had a big lunch at school," she fibbed, flashing a shy smile. "Please take it. My dad always says we should share when we can." The man hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the sandwich. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "What's your name?" "Layla," she replied, her smile growing wider. "What's yours?" "Carl," he said after a pause, as if he hadn't said his own name in a long time. Carl unwrapped the sandwich with care, as though it were a gift. He took a small bite, closing his eyes as he savored it. "This is the best thing I've had in days," he admitted, his voice filled with gratitude. Layla sat down on the bench beside him, her legs swinging as they dangled above the ground. "Why are you out here all by yourself?" she asked, her tone innocent but curious. Carl glanced at her, then back down at the sandwich. "Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan," he said carefully. "I made some mistakes and, well, here I am." Layla nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the sadness in his words. "My dad says everyone deserves a second chance," she offered. "Maybe things can get better for you." Carl smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it. The two sat in comfortable silence for a while. Layla watched the other children playing in the park while Carl finished the sandwich. When he was done, he turned to her with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Layla. You've got a kind heart. Don't ever lose that." What Layla didn't realize was that Marcus had been watching from a distance. He'd seen her approach the man, sandwich in hand, and felt a mix of pride and worry. He admired his daughter's compassion, but couldn't help but worry about her safety. The world wasn't always kind, and as much as he wanted to nurture Layla's big heart, he also wanted to protect it. When Layla finally bounded back to him, her eyes shining with excitement, Marcus knelt down to meet her gaze. "Who was that man?" he asked gently. "His name is Carl," Layla replied. "He looked so hungry, Dad. I gave him my sandwich." Marcus smiled, though his brow furrowed slightly. "That was a kind thing to do, Layla. But we need to be careful. Not everyone out there is safe, okay?" Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know, Dad, but he wasn't scary. He was just sad." Marcus pulled her into a hug. "You've got a big heart, kiddo. Just promise me you'll always let me know before you help someone, okay?" "Okay," Layla agreed, her voice muffled against his chest. As they walked home together, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Carl's tired eyes or the gnawing feeling that there was more to the man's story. Little did he know this was only the beginning. Layla's simple act of kindness had already set the wheels in motion for something much bigger than either she or Marcus could have imagined. What would happen next? And why would the police come knocking the very next day? As Layla and Marcus walked home that evening, the warmth of the setting sun casting long shadows across their neighborhood, Layla couldn't wait to share everything about Carl. She clutched her father's hand tightly, her voice bubbling with excitement as she described the man on the bench and how grateful he had been for her sandwich. "He said it was the best thing he's had in days, Dad," Layla exclaimed, her eyes wide with earnestness. "I think he's really nice. Just sad, you know?" Marcus listened intently. His heart tugged in two directions. He couldn't help but feel proud of his daughter's compassion, her natural instinct to see the best in people. But as a father, he also felt a creeping sense of unease. The world wasn't as simple as Layla saw it, and his job was to protect her from the parts of it she didn't yet understand. He gave her a soft smile, kneeling slightly so their eyes were level. "Layla, I'm really proud of you," he began, his tone gentle but firm. "What you did today was kind and thoughtful, but sometimes helping people can be tricky. We don't always know what someone is going through, and it's important to be careful too." Layla tilted her head, her curly hair bouncing. "But Dad, he didn't do anything scary. He was just hungry." Marcus sighed, standing upright again and squeezing her hand. "I know, sweetie, and it sounds like he needed someone to show him kindness. But next time, why don't we try to help together? That way we can make sure it's safe. Deal?" "Deal," Layla agreed, though her expression hinted at her quiet determination. In her mind, Carl wasn't a stranger anymore. He was someone who needed help, and she had decided she was going to be the one to give it. By the time they reached their apartment, the soft hum of the neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm. The air smelled faintly of Mrs. Dolores's famous lasagna baking upstairs. and the sound of Mr. Han's radio drifted from his corner shop. Their community wasn't perfect. People whispered about each other, judgments came easily, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. But it was home. As Layla climbed the stairs to their apartment, Marcus lingered for a moment, glancing back toward the park. Something about Carl had stuck with him. Maybe it was the look in the man's eyes, tired, resigned, but with a flicker of something else when Layla spoke to him. Marcus wasn't sure what it was, but it gnawed at him. Later that night, as Layla worked on her coloring books at the small kitchen table, Marcus found himself reflecting on their life together. It had been just the two of them since Layla's mother, Tiana, passed away 5 years earlier. Losing Tiana had been like losing the sun, and for a long time it felt as though their little apartment had been shrouded in shadow. But Layla had been the light that pulled Marcus through. Even as a toddler, she had a way of making the world feel a little brighter, her laugh a reminder that there was still good to be found. Raising her alone hadn't been easy. Marcus worked long hours as a delivery driver, juggling bills and schedules to make sure Layla had everything she needed. Their life wasn't lavish, but it was filled with love. And that love had shaped Layla into the kind, empathetic child she was today. A child who would give away her favorite sandwich to a stranger without a second thought. The next morning, the apartment building buzzed with its usual energy. Mrs. Dolores, a retired teacher with a penchant for gossip, was already stationed by her window when Marcus and Layla stepped outside. She waved them down immediately, her curiosity barely masked by feigned concern. "Marcus, darling, did I see Layla talking to a man in the park yesterday?" she asked, her sharp eyes darting between them. "You know, we have to be careful these days. You never know what kind of people are out there." Marcus forced a polite smile, steering Layla gently toward the sidewalk. "Thanks for the advice, Mrs. Dolores. We're always careful." But Layla couldn't help herself. "His name is Carl," she piped up, earning a startled look from Marcus. "And he's really nice. I gave him my sandwich." Mrs. Dolores's eyebrows shot up, and Marcus quickly ushered Layla away before the conversation could continue. He knew how quickly gossip spread in their building, and the last thing he wanted was for their neighbors to make assumptions about Carl or about them. At the corner shop, Mr. Han greeted them warmly, as he always did. He was one of the few people in the neighborhood who didn't seem to thrive on drama. His shop was a little haven, filled with everything from fresh produce to dusty stacks of old books. As Marcus grabbed a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, Layla wandered to the counter to chat with Mr. Han. "Did you meet someone new, Layla?" he asked, noticing the sparkle in her eyes. Layla nodded enthusiastically. "His name is Carl, and he's really nice. I gave him my sandwich, and he smiled a lot after that." Mr. Han smiled, his weathered face softening. "That's a good thing you did. Sometimes a little kindness can go a long way." Marcus, overhearing, felt a pang of relief. Mr. Han's calm demeanor was a reminder that not everyone in their community would jump to conclusions. Still, as they left the shop, Marcus couldn't shake the unease in his chest. That afternoon, Layla insisted on going back to the park. "I just want to see if Carl's okay, Dad," she said, her big brown eyes pleading with him. Marcus hesitated, but eventually agreed, deciding to keep a closer eye on things this time. When they arrived, Carl was sitting on the same bench, his head bowed as if deep in thought. Layla ran ahead, her excitement palpable. Marcus hung back, watching from a distance. As Layla handed Carl another sandwich, Marcus noticed something strange, a man standing at the edge of the park, partially hidden behind a tree. He wasn't dressed like the other park-goers, and his gaze was fixed on Carl with an intensity that made Marcus's stomach tighten. Carl seemed to notice too, his posture stiffening slightly as he glanced over Layla's shoulder. He accepted the sandwich but didn't smile as much this time, his eyes darting nervously toward the figure at the tree line. Marcus's protective instincts kicked in. He called Layla back to him, keeping his tone light so as not to alarm her. "Time to head home, sweetie. We've got dinner to make." As they walked away, Marcus stole one last glance over his shoulder. The man was still there, watching Carl with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Suspicion? Recognition? Whatever it was, Marcus knew one thing for sure. There was more to Carl's story than he or Layla realized, and for better or worse, they were already a part of it. The next day, as the warm afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood, Layla couldn't contain her excitement. She had packed a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water in her pink backpack, determined to visit Carl again. She convinced Marcus to let her stop by the park after school, though he insisted on staying nearby to keep an eye on her. His unease lingered after noticing the strange man watching Carl the day before, but he didn't want to discourage Layla's kindness. When they arrived at the park, Carl was sitting on the same bench, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. Layla ran over, her curly hair bouncing in the breeze, while Marcus stayed a few yards back, pretending to check his phone but keeping a close watch. "Hi, Carl," Layla greeted cheerfully, pulling the sandwich from her bag and holding it out to him. "I brought you lunch." Carl looked up, his tired eyes softening at the sight of her. A small smile crept across his face as he accepted the sandwich. "Thank you, Layla. You're too kind," he said, his voice gravelly but sincere. Layla plopped down on the bench beside him, her legs swinging in the air. "You're welcome. I thought you might like peanut butter and jelly again. It's my favorite." Carl unwrapped the sandwich carefully, taking a small bite and savoring it. For a moment, it seemed like the weight on his shoulders lifted just a little. Layla watched him eat, her curiosity bubbling over. "Carl," she began, tilting her head, "why do you stay here in the park? Don't you have somewhere else to go?" Carl paused mid-bite, his expression growing somber. He stared at the ground for a long moment before answering. I used to have a place to go, a family, but I made some mistakes and I let them down." Layla's brow furrowed. "What happened?" Carl hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's a long story, Layla. Let's just say I wasn't the person I should have been, and now I'm trying to figure out how to make things right." Layla's young mind struggled to process his cryptic words, but her heart told her one thing. Carl needed someone to believe in him. "Maybe you could talk to them," she offered earnestly. "Maybe they'd forgive you." Carl's lips curled into a faint, bittersweet smile. "You've got a good heart, kid. Don't ever lose that." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus called Layla back. "Time to head home, sweetie," he said, waving her over. Layla gave Carl a quick hug before running back to her dad. Carl watched her go, his expression a mixture of gratitude and sadness. He glanced around the park nervously, as though expecting someone or something. Back at their apartment, Layla was buzzing with excitement, eager to tell Marcus more about her conversation with Carl. Marcus listened carefully, his mind preoccupied. He didn't want to dampen Layla's enthusiasm, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to Carl than met the eye. The knock at the door came just as Marcus was setting the table for dinner. It was sharp, deliberate, and unexpected. Layla looked up from her seat, her brow furrowing. Who could that be? Marcus opened the door to find two police officers standing in the hallway, their uniforms crisp and their expressions serious. The taller of the two, a man with a deep voice and a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first. "Good evening, sir. Are you Marcus Hayes?" Marcus's stomach tightened. "Yes. Can I help you?" The officer glanced past Marcus into the apartment, his gaze briefly landing on Layla before returning to Marcus. "We'd like to ask you and your daughter a few questions about a man she's been seen talking to in the park. His name is Carl." Layla gasped softly. "Is something wrong with Carl?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. The second officer, a woman with a kinder expression, stepped forward. "We're investigating an incident that may involve Carl. We're not here to accuse anyone, but we need to gather some information." Marcus felt his protective instincts flare. "What kind of incident?" he asked, his tone cautious. The officers exchanged a glance before the woman continued. "There's a chance Carl is connected to a case involving missing property and a disturbance in a nearby neighborhood. We're trying to piece together his movements and determine if he's involved." Layla jumped in before Marcus could respond. "Carl didn't do anything wrong," she insisted, her voice firm. "He's nice, and he's just hungry. I gave him my sandwich, and we talked. He wouldn't hurt anyone." The male officer's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained neutral. "That's good to hear, Layla. Can you tell us what Carl said to you? Did he mention where he's from or what he's doing in the park?" Layla's brow furrowed as she tried to recall their conversations. "He said he made mistakes and let his family down, but he didn't say anything about hurting anyone. He's just sad." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his mind racing. He wanted to protect Layla from whatever this was, but he also didn't want to ignore the possibility that the officer's concerns were valid. The male officer nodded, jotting something down in a small notebook. "Thank you for sharing that, Layla. We're not saying Carl is dangerous, but we need to make sure everything checks out. If you see him again, we'd appreciate it if you let us know." As the officers handed Marcus a card and left, Layla's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, they think Carl is bad, but he's not. He's just hungry." Marcus knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "I know you believe in Carl, sweetheart, and maybe he's exactly who you think he is. But sometimes people's stories are more complicated than they seem. The best thing we can do is hope for the truth to come out." As Marcus comforted Layla, his own heart wrestled with conflicting emotions. He wanted to trust his daughter's instincts, but the officer's visit had shaken him. Who was Carl, really? And what had he gotten himself, and by extension them, into? One thing was certain: the story was far from over. The next morning, the air in the neighborhood felt heavier than usual. The soft hum of routine, the clink of coffee cups, the rustle of newspapers, was undercut by something more insidious: whispers. Word about the police visit had spread, and the tight-knit community was abuzz with speculation. As Marcus and Layla stepped out of their apartment, they could feel the weight of the curious eyes that followed them. Mrs. Dolores, perched at her usual spot by the window, waved Marcus over with a saccharine smile. "Good morning, Marcus," she chirped, though her tone dripped with something less friendly. "I couldn't help but notice those officers at your door last night. Everything all right?" Marcus forced a tight smile, not wanting to stoke the gossip further. "Just a misunderstanding, Mrs. Dolores. Nothing to worry about." But Mrs. Dolores wasn't convinced. "You know, people have been saying that the man Layla's been talking to might not be the safest sort. These things can be complicated." "We're fine, thanks," Marcus replied curtly, steering Layla away before the conversation could go any further. As they walked toward the school, Marcus glanced down at Layla. Her usual bubbly demeanor was muted, her steps slower, her face clouded with unease. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You okay, kiddo?" Layla hesitated before nodding. "I think so. It's just, why does everyone think Carl is bad, Dad? He didn't do anything wrong." Marcus sighed. Sometimes, people jump to conclusions when they don't understand something. But don't let it get to you, okay? You know what you did came from the right place. At school, Layla quickly realized the whispers had followed her there. A group of kids gathered near the swings, pointing and giggling as she passed. "Hey, Layla," one boy called out mockingly. "Is your new friend a criminal?" "Did the cops come to take you away too?" another chimed in, laughter rippling through the group. Layla's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She wanted to yell back, to tell them they were wrong about Carl, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she ducked her head and hurried past, her once unshakable confidence now wavering. Meanwhile, Marcus wasn't faring much better. At work, the disapproving glances from his co-workers were hard to miss. One of them, a man named Greg, who never missed an opportunity to needle someone, approached him during lunch. "So, Marcus," Greg began, leaning casually against the break room counter. "Heard you had some police action at your place last night. Everything all right?" Marcus clenched his jaw. "Everything's fine, Greg. Thanks for asking." Greg smirked. "Hey, no judgment here. But maybe keep an eye on who your kid's hanging out with, just saying." Marcus didn't respond, but his grip on his coffee mug tightened. The judgment, the assumptions, it was exhausting. When he picked Layla up from school that afternoon, her usual bright smile was noticeably absent. She climbed into the car silently, staring out the window as Marcus drove. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, gently. Layla shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think maybe I did something wrong, Dad. Everyone thinks Carl is bad. What if I shouldn't have helped him?" Marcus's heart ached at the doubt in her voice. "Hey, listen to me," he said firmly. "What you did was brave and kind. Don't let what other people think make you question that. They don't know Carl like you do." At the corner shop, Mr. Hahn noticed Layla's subdued demeanor immediately. He called her over while Marcus picked up a few groceries. "Layla," Mr. Hahn said warmly, leaning on the counter. "You all right, kiddo? You don't seem like yourself." Layla shrugged. "Everyone thinks I was wrong to help Carl. Maybe they're right." Mr. Hahn frowned thoughtfully. After a moment, he said, When I first came to this country, I didn't know anyone. I had no money, no friends, and it felt like the world was against me. One day, a man stopped me on the street and offered me a warm meal. That one act of kindness reminded me that not everyone is cruel. It gave me the strength to keep going." Layla looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Really?" Mr. Hahn nodded. Sometimes helping someone isn't about fixing everything for them. It's about reminding them that they're not invisible. What you did for Carl, it matters. Layla managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mr. Hahn." That evening, as Layla worked on a drawing at the kitchen table, Marcus made a decision. He needed to know more about Carl for both his and Layla's sake. After dinner, he told Layla he was going for a walk and headed to the park. Carl was there, as expected, sitting on the same bench. He looked up as Marcus approached, a flicker of recognition in his tired eyes. "Marcus, right?" Carl said, his voice cautious. Marcus nodded, sitting down on the bench but keeping a careful distance. "I wanted to talk to you about Layla." Carl's posture stiffened. "She's a good kid. You don't need to worry about her." "That's the thing," Marcus said, his tone firm. "I do worry. You seem like a decent guy, but I need to know more. Who are you, Carl? What's your story?" Carl hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I told Layla, I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm not a bad person." "That's not enough," Marcus pressed. "The police came to my door last night. They think you're involved in something. If I'm going to let my daughter keep helping you, I need to know the truth." Carl's eyes darted around the park, as if checking to see if they were being watched. Finally, he sighed. "I can't tell you everything, not yet. But I promise you, Marcus, I'm not dangerous. Layla, she's done more for me than anyone has in a long time. I'd never hurt her." The sincerity in Carl's voice gave Marcus pause, but it wasn't enough to quell his unease. He stood, his expression guarded. "If you care about Layla, you'll stay out of trouble. That's all I'm asking." Carl nodded silently, watching as Marcus walked away. As Marcus returned home, the unanswered questions swirled in his mind. Who was Carl really? And why did he seem so afraid? One thing was certain. This wasn't over. The following afternoon, Layla insisted on going back to the park to visit Carl. Marcus hesitated, but seeing the earnest determination in her eyes, he relented. "All right, but I'm coming with you, just to keep an eye on things." When they arrived, Carl was sitting on the same bench, but his shoulders seemed heavier, his posture more slumped than usual. Layla ran ahead with her signature enthusiasm, her small frame radiating a warmth that seemed to brighten even Carl's weary expression. "Hi, Carl," Layla chirped, pulling out another sandwich she'd packed herself. "Peanut butter and jelly again. I hope you're not tired of it." Carl chuckled softly, his face relaxing as he accepted the sandwich. "Never. Thank you, Layla." As Layla sat beside him, her legs swinging in rhythm, she noticed something peeking out of Carl's weathered bag, a small, crumpled photograph. Intrigued, she leaned closer. "What's that?" Carl followed her gaze and stiffened. He quickly stuffed the photo deeper into his bag, but Layla's curiosity was already piqued. "Is it a picture of your family?" she asked, her voice soft. Carl hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the sandwich wrapper. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he reached into the bag and pulled out the photograph. It was creased and faded, but Layla could still make out the smiling faces of a younger Carl, a woman, and a little girl. They looked happy, carefree, standing in front of a large house with a swing set in the yard. Layla's eyes widened. "Is that your family? They look so nice." Carl stared at the photograph, his expression a mixture of longing and pain. "They were," he said quietly. "This was before everything fell apart." "What happened?" Layla asked gently, sensing the weight of his words. Carl sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the photo. "I made mistakes, big ones. I used to run a charity, a good one, helping people who needed it, but I trusted the wrong person. A partner. He convinced me to approve some shady deals, and before I knew it, money was missing. A lot of money." Layla listened intently, her eyes full of concern. "What did you do?" "I tried to fix it," Carl continued, his voice thick with regret. "But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The charity collapsed and people started pointing fingers. I lost everything: my home, my reputation, my family." Layla frowned. "But it wasn't your fault, right? It was your partner's." Carl shook his head. "Doesn't matter. I should have been more careful. My wife, she couldn't forgive me for what happened. She took our daughter and left." Layla reached out and placed a small hand on Carl's arm. "I think you're still a good person, Carl. Everyone makes mistakes." Carl looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're too kind, Layla. More than I deserve." As they walked back home, Layla couldn't stop thinking about Carl's story. "Dad, why do you think people stop forgiving others? Doesn't everyone deserve another chance?" Marcus glanced at her, his heart aching at her innocence. "Sometimes people get hurt so badly that it's hard for them to forgive, but that doesn't mean it's impossible." That evening, Marcus decided it was time to dig deeper. Carl's story had confirmed some of his suspicions, but Marcus needed to know the full truth. He reached out to an old friend, Ben, a retired detective who now ran a private investigative service. When Marcus explained the situation, Ben was intrigued. "Sounds like there's a lot going on here. I'll see what I can find. Give me a couple of days." True to his word, Ben called Marcus 2 days later. "I found some information on your guy," he said. "Carl, right? Full name's Carl Bennett. Used to be a pretty big deal in the nonprofit world. He ran a charity called Hope Bridge, but it went under about 5 years ago." Marcus nodded, listening closely. "That lines up with what he told us. What else did you find?" Ben's tone grew more serious. "Here's where it gets interesting. There was an investigation into missing funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Carl's partner was the prime suspect, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. Unfortunately, Carl took most of the heat because he was the face of the organization." "Was he guilty?" Marcus asked. "Doesn't look like it," Ben replied. "Everything I found suggests he was more of a victim of bad judgment and bad luck. But the court of public opinion isn't exactly forgiving, and the guy's life fell apart." Marcus sighed, the weight of the information settling on his shoulders. "Thanks, Ben. This helps." "Be careful, Marcus," Ben warned. "People like Carl, they've been through a lot. Sometimes they don't want help, even when they need it." That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table long after Layla had gone to bed, staring at the notes he'd scribbled during his call with Ben. Carl's story was tragic, but it wasn't simple. Marcus couldn't decide whether to trust him completely or keep his guard up. One thing was clear, though. Layla's instinct to help Carl had been right. The man needed someone to believe in him. The question now was how far Marcus was willing to go to offer that belief. The following weekend, Layla begged Marcus to take her to the park again to see Carl. Despite his reservations, Marcus agreed, keeping a watchful eye as Layla bounded ahead. The park was unusually quiet that day, the usual hum of children playing replaced by a strange tension in the air. As they approached Carl's usual bench, Marcus noticed 2 police officers standing nearby speaking to Carl. Their postures were stiff, their voices low but firm. Carl, who had been sitting with his head down, now looked up at them, his face a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Layla tugged at Marcus's hand. "What are they doing? Are they helping Carl?" Marcus frowned, pulling her closer. "Stay here, Layla," he said gently. "Let me go see what's going on." Ignoring Layla's protests, Marcus approached the scene cautiously. As he drew closer, he caught snippets of the officer's conversation. "We just need you to answer a few questions, Mr. Bennett," one officer said. "It's about the Hope Bridge investigation." "I've already told you everything I know," Carl replied, his voice shaky. "That was years ago." The other officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We have reason to believe there's more to the story. You need to come with us." Carl's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered. But he didn't resist as the officers gently took him by the arm. From a distance, Layla watched, her heart pounding. "Dad, they're taking him. Why are they taking him?" Marcus turned to his daughter, his expression pained. "Stay here, Layla. I'll handle this." He hurried over to the officers. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his tone firm but polite. "What's this about?" The taller officer turned to him, clearly not eager to explain. "This is official business, sir. We're following up on an old investigation." "About the charity?" Marcus pressed, his jaw tightening. "You do know Carl wasn't the one who took that money, right?" The officer frowned. "We're aware of the allegations against his former partner, but Mr. Bennett was the director of Hope Bridge. He has a responsibility to answer questions." Marcus stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. "And in the meantime, his life's been ruined. You don't have enough evidence to charge him, so why are you dragging him in now?" The shorter officer sighed. "New information has come to light. We just need to confirm some details." Carl, who had been silent during the exchange, finally spoke. "It's all right, Marcus. Let them do what they need to do. I have nothing to hide." Before Marcus could argue further, the officers escorted Carl toward their patrol car. Layla, unable to stay put any longer, ran to Marcus's side, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, why are they taking him? Carl didn't do anything bad." Marcus knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "I know, Layla, I know. But sometimes, people have to go through tough situations to prove the truth. We just have to believe in him, okay?" Layla nodded, her small frame trembling. "But who's going to help him now?" Marcus didn't have an answer, but as he looked into his daughter's tearful eyes, he made a silent vow to do whatever he could to help Carl. That evening, Marcus called Ben again and told him what had happened. Ben was skeptical. "If they're bringing him in now, they must have something solid," he said. "But I'll dig around and see if I can find out what's going on." Meanwhile, Layla couldn't stop thinking about Carl. She spent the evening making a poster that read, "Carl is a good person," in bright, bold letters. The next morning, she carried it to Mr. Hahn's shop, determined to rally support for her friend. Mr. Hahn listened as Layla explained everything, her voice trembling but determined. "We have to help him, Mr. Hahn. He's not bad, he's just sad." Mr. Hahn smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're right, Layla. Sometimes the world needs a reminder that not everyone deserves the judgment they get." He hung the poster in the shop window and promised to spread the word. By the end of the day, a few neighbors had joined Layla's cause, including Mrs. Gonzalez from the apartment upstairs, and even the initially skeptical Mrs. Dolores. "That man's always been polite to me when I've seen him in the park," Mrs. Dolores admitted grudgingly. "Maybe we should give him the benefit of the doubt." Meanwhile, Marcus got a call from Ben. "You were right," Ben said. "The new evidence points straight to Carl's former partner, a guy named Richard Larson. Turns out, Larson was caught skimming money from another nonprofit last year. The guy has a pattern." "So, why is Carl still being dragged into this?" Marcus asked, frustration boiling over. "Probably because Larson framed him so well the first time," Ben replied. "But I've got the documentation to prove it. I'll send it over to the detectives on Carl's case." With the new evidence in hand, Marcus called the precinct and insisted on speaking to the officers who had detained Carl. He explained everything Ben had uncovered, backing it up with the documents. The officers listened carefully, their skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. "We'll review this," the taller officer said finally. "If it checks out, we'll make sure Mr. Bennett is released." That evening, Marcus and Layla received a call from Carl himself. "I'm being let go," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're saying I'm not a suspect anymore." Layla jumped up and down, cheering. "I knew you didn't do anything bad, Carl." When Carl returned to the park the next day, he was greeted by a small group of neighbors holding signs of support. Layla ran to him and threw her arms around his waist. "I told you we wouldn't give up on you," she exclaimed. Carl knelt down, his eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, Layla. Thank you for believing in me when no one else would." As Marcus watched the scene unfold, he felt a deep sense of pride, not just in Layla, but in the small ripple of change she had created in their community. And while the battle for Carl's reputation wasn't over, it was clear that Layla's kindness had already made an indelible impact. The day Carl was released from custody was a crisp, sunny morning, the kind that hinted at hope and renewal. Marcus and Layla were waiting by the park when Carl arrived, his steps hesitant, as if he weren't quite sure he belonged. Layla spotted him first and raced toward him, her arms outstretched. "Carl!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the park. Carl crouched down to meet her, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Layla threw her arms around him, holding tight, as if her hug could erase all the struggles he'd endured. "You're free!" she exclaimed, her eyes shining. "I knew they'd figure it out." Carl chuckled softly. "They did, thanks to you and your dad." He glanced at Marcus, who approached with a proud but cautious smile. Marcus extended his hand, and Carl shook it firmly. "I'm glad it's over," Marcus said. "But this wasn't just us. You deserve a chance to move forward now." Carl nodded, his gaze turning toward the horizon. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. I need to fix things with my family." Later that afternoon, Marcus and Layla sat with Carl in a small coffee shop near the park. Carl pulled the crumpled family photograph from his pocket, smoothing it out on the table. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. "My daughter's name is Emily," he said. "She was just a kid when everything fell apart. I haven't seen her in years, but I've thought about her every day." "Do you think she'd want to see you again?" Layla asked, her voice filled with cautious optimism. Carl sighed. "I don't know, but I have to try." With Marcus's help, Carl contacted Emily through social media. The message was simple but heartfelt. "I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. If you're willing to talk, I'll be here." The wait for a response was agonizing, but when Emily finally replied, Carl's hands trembled as he read her words. "Let's meet. I have questions, but I'm willing to listen." The following week, Carl met Emily at the same park bench where Layla had first found him. Marcus and Layla waited nearby, giving him space while still being close enough to offer support. When Emily arrived, Carl stood awkwardly, his hands fumbling as he tried to find the right words. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice cracking. "I know I've let you down." Emily's expression was guarded, but there was a softness in her eyes. "I've been angry for a long time, Dad, but maybe it's time to talk." Their conversation stretched on for hours, covering old wounds and tentative hopes. By the end of it, Carl's face was streaked with tears, but there was also a sense of relief. He and Emily embraced, their connection fragile but real. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Carl's story began to spread through the neighborhood. What had started as whispers of judgment and suspicion transformed into conversations about compassion and second chances. Mrs. Dolores, who had been one of Carl's harshest critics, approached him one afternoon with a loaf of homemade banana bread. "I misjudged you," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "You've been through a lot, and I see now that you're just trying to move forward. I hope you'll accept this as an apology." Carl accepted the bread with a gracious smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Dolores. That means a lot." Meanwhile, Mr. Hahn, inspired by Layla's unwavering kindness, decided to take action of his own. He placed a sign in the window of his shop that read, "Community Care Drive. Donations accepted here." He encouraged neighbors to contribute food, clothing, and essentials for those in need, promising to deliver the items to local shelters. Layla was thrilled when she saw the sign. "This is amazing, Mr. Han," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Can I help?" "Of course," Mr. Han replied, handing her a stack of flyers. "Why don't you pass these out to your friends at school?" Layla spent the next week spreading the word, her enthusiasm contagious. Soon, the shop was filled with donations, and Mr. Han had to enlist the help of several neighbors to organize and distribute them. The drive became a regular event, drawing the community closer together and fostering a sense of unity that had been missing for years. At home, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Watching Layla rally the neighborhood and stand by Carl with unwavering faith made him realize something profound. His daughter wasn't just learning from him, she was teaching him too. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Marcus turned to Layla with a smile. "You know, kiddo, you've taught me a lot these past few weeks." Layla tilted her head, confused. "I have." Marcus nodded. "You've shown me that sometimes it's not about playing it safe, it's about believing in people even when it's hard. I'm really proud of you." Layla beamed, her smile lighting up the room. "Thanks, Dad, but you helped too." Carl, now reinvigorated with a sense of purpose, decided to use his experience to make a difference. He began volunteering at one of the local shelters, sharing his story with others who had faced similar struggles. His honesty and vulnerability made him a source of inspiration for many. One day, Carl approached Layla and Marcus with an idea. "I've been thinking," he said. "What if we started a program to help people who've fallen on hard times like I did? We could call it Second Chances." Layla's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. Can we help?" "Absolutely," Carl replied. "It's the least I can do to pay forward the kindness you showed me." With the support of the community, Carl's program quickly gained traction. Marcus helped with logistics, Layla designed posters, and Mr. Han offered his shop as a hub for meetings. The initiative focused on providing resources, mentorship, and emotional support for people rebuilding their lives. By the time the first year of the program had passed, the neighborhood was nearly unrecognizable, not in its appearance but in its spirit. People who had once kept to themselves now worked together, united by a shared commitment to kindness and understanding, and at the heart of it all was Layla, whose simple act of sharing a sandwich had sparked a transformation no one could have predicted. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus and Layla walked through the park hand in hand. They passed Carl's bench, now a symbol of redemption and hope. "Dad," Layla said, her voice thoughtful, "do you think we'll ever run out of people to help?" Marcus smiled, squeezing her hand. "Not a chance, kiddo. And as long as there are people like you, I think the world's going to be just fine." Layla grinned, her heart full. Together they headed home, ready for whatever new challenges and opportunities tomorrow might bring. The park was quieter than usual that afternoon, the autumn leaves rustling softly in the breeze as Carl sat on the same bench where it all began. This time, however, his shoulders weren't slumped and his eyes weren't weighed down by despair. Instead, they were filled with a quiet determination. In his hands, he held a stack of flyers with bold letters at the top. Second Chances Initiative, helping others rebuild. Layla skipped toward him, her ever-present smile lighting up her face. "Hi, Carl. Are those for your new program?" she asked, plopping down on the bench beside him. Carl nodded, his smile warm. Yep, I'm hoping to get these out around the neighborhood today. Thought I might find some folks who could use a hand, just like I did." "That's awesome," Layla said, her eyes shining. "Can I help?" "Of course," Carl replied. He handed her a few flyers and watched as she eagerly ran off toward a group of people at the playground. He couldn't help but chuckle. Layla's boundless enthusiasm was contagious, and it reminded him of why he'd started this journey. When Marcus arrived, he greeted Carl with a nod. "Looks like things are moving along." "They are," Carl said, his tone thoughtful. "And I owe it all to you and Layla. If she hadn't reached out to me that day, I don't know where I'd be." Marcus smiled, glancing toward his daughter. "She's got a way of seeing the good in people. I guess it's something we could all use a little more of." Carl's gaze followed Marcus's, his expression softening. "She didn't just help me survive. She reminded me that it's okay to hope again. That's why I'm doing this, because I want to pass that feeling on to someone else." Later that week, Carl's new initiative officially launched with a small event at the community center. Neighbors gathered to learn about the program, which focused on providing practical resources, like job training, financial literacy classes, and mentorship for those trying to get back on their feet. Carl spoke candidly about his own struggles, his honesty inspiring others to share their stories too. Layla played a big role in the event, running a booth where kids decorated kindness cards to be included with care packages for people in need. She worked tirelessly, her energy never waning, as she encouraged other children to get involved. At one point during the event, Carl approached Layla and knelt down to her level. "I want you to know something, Layla," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "You changed my life. You didn't just give me a sandwich, you gave me a reason to believe in people again." Layla's cheeks flushed with pride. "I'm just glad I could help." Carl smiled. "And because of you, a lot more people are going to get the help they need. I promise to keep paying it forward." As the weeks passed, the Second Chances initiative gained momentum, drawing volunteers from all over the neighborhood. Marcus and Layla became deeply involved, helping to organize events and spreading awareness about the program. Marcus even started giving talks about compassion and the importance of community, sharing how his daughter's small act had sparked something far greater. One evening, as they walked home from another successful event, Layla turned to her father. "Dad, do you think we've made a difference?" Marcus stopped and knelt down, looking her in the eye. "Absolutely, kiddo. Look around. People are helping each other. They're working together in ways they never did before. That's because of you." Layla smiled, but her face grew thoughtful. "Do you think other neighborhoods could do the same thing? What if we helped them start their own programs?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. "You never stop, do you? But I think that's a great idea." Over the following months, Layla's idea took shape. With the help of Carl and Mr. Hahn, she and Marcus developed a small outreach program designed to teach other communities how to start their own kindness initiatives. They created simple guides and hosted workshops, sharing the lessons they'd learned. The outreach program became an extension of Carl's Second Chances initiative, spreading the message of hope and compassion far beyond their own neighborhood. One day, as Marcus watched Layla speak to a group of new volunteers, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. His daughter wasn't just a kid anymore. She was a leader, someone who inspired others to believe in the power of kindness. And though the road ahead was sure to have its challenges, Marcus knew that together, they could face anything. That night, as Layla and Marcus sat on the couch flipping through photos from the latest event, Layla rested her head on her father's shoulder. "Dad, do you think it's possible for one person to change the world?" Marcus smiled, wrapping an arm around her. I think you've already started, Layla, and if everyone did just one small thing, imagine what the world could be like." Layla grinned, her heart full of hope. "I think we should keep going." Marcus chuckled. "Oh, I don't think you'll let me stop." As the camera pans out on their cozy apartment, the light from their living room spilling into the darkened street, the message is clear. Even the smallest act of kindness can create a ripple effect that changes lives. Layla's story is proof that when we reach out to others with compassion, we open the door to a brighter, kinder future. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Let us know in the comments how you plan to spread kindness in your own life. Together, we can make the world a better place, one act of kindness at a time.